The summit began with praise to Uganda's celebrated refugee model of the open border policy. The United Nations Secretary General wants other countries to step up and follow Uganda's example.
I have seen the Uganda borders open. I have seen the doors of the Uganda people open. I've seen the hearts of the Uganda people open. But not all doors are open in the world. Not all refugees are accepted. Some are rejected. And sometimes in countries much richer than Uganda.
The UN Secretary General referred to the refugee situation in Uganda as the biggest crisis in Africa since the Rwanda genocide. This is due to a continuous and unprecedented influx of people fleeing conflict in neighboring South Sudan, DR Congo, and Somalia, among others.
These crises are caused by defective ideology. The ideology of exploiting identity instead of distilling people's interests and pushing them. The ideology of sectarianism in Africa must be condemned.
Uganda is host to 1.3 million refugees. 3/4 of the refugees come from South Sudan. An average of 2,000 people a day cross the border. This influx is testing the limits of Uganda's generosity as it exerts a lot of pressure on available resources. As commitments in support for Uganda's refugee situation continue to flow in, at this summit, leaders from across the world are increasingly calling on warring parties, especially in South Sudan, to cease fighting and return to dialogue so that people can go back to their homes. According to the UN Refugee Agency, at least 50,000 people have died in South Sudan's civil war, which began in December 2013 as a result of a struggle for power between President Salva Kiir and former Vice President Riek Machar.
There is not the capacity in the international community to go on treating the symptoms. We must start addressing the causes. And therefore, we strongly encourage regional leaders to redouble coordinated efforts to bring an end to the violence and encourage a genuinely inclusive political process in South Sudan.
Some of the big contributors at today's Solidarity Summit are the European Union, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, United States, China, and Saudi Arabia, among others. The funds will go towards most pressing humanitarian needs in areas of food assistance, protection, shelter, provision of water and sanitation, education, and resilience building. Michael Baleke, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Well, let's now get more information on that situation as it unfolds, and I'm joined by Terry Ongaro, the Communications Officer of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Uganda. She's joining me live from Kampala. Terry, thank you. Now, Uganda's refugee policy has been widely praised internationally. What is it that they do that other countries should emulate?
What Uganda does, what is exceptional is that Uganda has received 2,000 refugees a day for the past year. This is unprecedented, and they've kept their borders open, continue to keep the borders open, and refugees are still arriving from South Sudan. So, Uganda also has a policy of giving land to refugees to settle and cultivate as long as they're in asylum. This is also unique. Most countries with similar numbers of refugees put them in camps. In Uganda, they live in settlements side by side with host communities, and they're therefore able to enjoy an exile with a lot more dignity than in other situations. In Uganda, refugees have access to the same basic services that nationals have, and this is part of the reason that the government decided to hold the Solidarity Summit, because the presence of such large numbers of refugees is stretching the capacities of the state and of host communities.
Well, Terry, many countries, though, are now turning their backs on foreigners or migrants in need. An example being Kenya there. Should there be guaranteed financial support before refugees are accepted by a country?
No. The short answer is no. Refugees do not leave their countries out of choice. We see the trouble that there is in South Sudan. There's conflict, there's human rights violations, we have hunger. People do not leave their countries out of choice. People leave their countries to save their lives, and because they really don't have anywhere else to go. What we've seen today has been a fantastic response to an appeal by Uganda and the United Nations from the international community. Today we saw the private sector, we saw countries in Africa, we saw countries that are not considered to be traditional donors showing solidarity. This is the spirit that countries like Uganda need in order to meet them halfway. Uganda almost does not have a choice in terms of having the refugees on its territory, and what it needs is this kind of solidarity that we've seen today with nations and the private sector and individuals coming together to provide that support that is needed for Uganda.
Right, so there's been a lot of solidarity and what you call a fantastic response by the international community today on Uganda's appeal regarding the refugees. But it is becoming fairly evident, though, that donors are becoming quite reluctant to channel resources to countries hosting huge numbers of refugees. What more, though, can the international community do to plug that financial gap?
Today we heard most of the so-called traditional donors, the donors from the West, urge donors from other countries to join in the support for refugee protection and assistance. Those countries continue to maintain their commitment. They are the ones who have supported Uganda and other countries for decades. But what we'd like to see is an opening of this space, not just by humanitarian donors, but also by development actors. Today we had the World Bank and the African Development Bank pledge to provide hundreds of millions of dollars to support the development of areas that are hosting refugees. So we're seeing a new way of dealing with refugees. Traditionally, it's been enclosed in what they called like a humanitarian budget space, and now we're going to see an opening where development actors come in as well and work with the government and the people of Uganda to provide what we call area-based support so that the communities that are hosting refugees will also benefit. We're talking about schools, hospitals, rural roads that become damaged with all the aid that is coming through. And if we have more development assistance going to those areas, then the price tag for humanitarian support will diminish, and it will allow the precious funds that do come for humanitarian support to deal with the most urgent needs of new arrivals.
Well, and in South Sudan's case, though, many of them are fleeing the conflict in that country. So what kind of interventionist methods are needed here to prevent conflicts from escalating and subsequently leading to this kind of mass displacements that we're seeing at the moment?
The question you're asking was one of the main themes of today's summit. Most delegations called for the international community to address root causes. We heard from the President of Uganda that he is in discussion with both sides of the conflict in South Sudan, and there is consensus among all actors that they do need to arrive at a political solution in South Sudan, that a military solution is not going to work. It will continue to bleed the country of its citizens. So there is the recognition that there needs to be a political solution. The regional actors need to come together, and the people of South Sudan, the leaders of South Sudan, need to commit to have a peaceful resolution of their problem in order that people will not flee the country and people can continue to enjoy their rights in their own home country.
All right, Terry Ongaro, the Communications Officer of the UNHCR in Uganda, thank you.